were going to be part of Reality Hack?
Maybe 3 or 4 days before Reality Hack.
Damn. That is not a lot of time. How did you end up involved in it?
That's an amazing question. So I think I was tapped to mentor not very long before it started. I'd had conversations beforehand, for months beforehand, about, are you going to be a participant? And I thought, as the person who teaches the VR class, I'd feel a little bad if I won, and it feels a little weird to be in a hackathon where you'd feel bad if you won. So I pushed off applying and was like, well, at some point I'll either be invited to judge, invited to mentor, or end up on staff inexplicably. And I got invited to mentor, and then gradually ended up increasingly towards staff-ishness over time.
We needed people.
Absolutely.
And we needed talented people, too.
Thank you.
We also need talented people for my podcast.
Fascinating that you should mention that.
Good after morning, and welcome to On the Dome, a podcast about non-expert college-age youth. And today, we're not actually talking specifically about Reality Hack, but we're talking about virtual reality. It's always like this thing of the future, but we're actually going to dive into its past and its present today. And I have a very special guest for that.
Hello. I am Aubrey Simonson. My pronouns are he, him. I've been involved in VR as a space for something like 6 years now. I'm a Unity developer and researcher at Northeastern University, and have taught classes and taken classes and been around at Tufts, Harvard, MIT, and Wellesley in the last couple of years. I think that's
You've
the
just
summary.
been doing the whole Boston circuit, huh?
Absolutely.
Do you have, which Boston college do you think has the best mascot? Or, colors?
That's a tough one. I think they're all kind of terrible.
I don't disagree with you.
I think the only one that I can really that comes to mind off the top of my head immediately is, of all the places that I have taught or done research or things like that recently, is Northeastern has the husky, and that's it's a noun, which is great. You can picture it in your mind. If someone says it, there's an image that is evoked. It seems good.
I've always thought it's confusing why MIT is not the Beavers. We're the engineers.
Exactly.
Which is...
What does that mean?
I don't know what that means. There's a lot of different ways to be an engineer, and none of them are particularly athletic.
Exactly.
Well, some of them are more than others, but it's not like the mechanical engineers.
I feel like your mascot is supposed to be different than the students it represents. It's supposed to be symbolic in some way, and there's no symbolic property to the
exactly
engineers.
literal.
That's just the people.
No, Huskies are pretty good. UW, the University of Washington, which was, I guess, kind of my home team growing up, also the Huskies, highly approve. But, I have to root for the engineers, so.
Understandable.
Yeah.
Understandable.
But, I guess the big question is, how did you get into VR?
Yeah, this one's kind of a funny story. So I started Wellesley in 2015, a deep past now. Sure that I was a political scientist.
Okay.
I went into political science. I knew that degree was going to lead me to either maybe law or more likely journalism.
Right.
And it was going to be either text or video as the journalistic medium. Probably video journalism. I'd taken a film class. I knew I liked editing. I knew that I liked storytelling, and I knew that I wanted it to be something serious and real world and high impact. I was certain.
Okay.
And then my freshman year, I really, really badly needed a job. And this place in the basement of the Wellesley College Library called the Knapp Technology Center was hiring. And the qualifications you needed was a vague interest in any form of new media and to be a freshman. And the theory behind this was to only hire freshmen to do a job that was going to end up being relatively high skilled, so that by the time they graduate, they know what they're doing.
Oh, there you go.
That was our theory. Yeah, so my freshman year, I am sitting doing video editing for some club in our little basement area, and someone reaches out to me, stops as walking through a common space and stops and goes, "Are you video editing?" And I was like, "Yes." And they were like, "Do you need a job?" And I was like, "Yes, actually, I do." And so this is how I became an app intern. We were tasked with, if any person during your shift approached the desk and had a question related to new media, However you might define that, it was your job to answer that question, and you generally did not know the answer in advance. So you got really good at, like, very, very rapidly Googling, this thing does not work, why? And in between people having questions for you, you either worked on longer-term projects that were in collaboration with students, professors, etc., or spend some time trying to fill in skills where you knew that someone would have those questions in the future so that you were at all prepared.
So it's kind of like help desk meets research.
Exactly. It's like research help desk, basically.
It's a good way to learn, though.
It was incredibly effective. It was, like, life-changing and very, very useful. Yeah, it was really good. Anywho, I did that for about a semester. And then after a semester of doing it, we took a tour out to Brandeis, which has a similar space. And I tried on a Samsung Gear.
Oh, god dang.
In 2016, which for reference is a $20 piece of plastic that holds a smartphone to your face.
I'm familiar, yeah.
Yeah. They technically qualify as a VR headset, but you really have to be having a broad definition of that term. And I took the headset off, and I think the first thing that I said was, "Film is dead." I don't think that's true, but I was really having a moment. And at that point, I basically pivoted everything that I was doing really, really hard. Yeah. Because I had started my undergraduate degree, like, so sure about going into political science, I had, like, front-loaded all of the classes that were in my major. So by the time I, like, had this realization, it was not too late to change my major, but I had enough sunk cost that I still finished the first one. So I'm, like, a VR researcher with an inexplicable degree in political science.
Have you found it applies at all?
In some ways.
Okay, tell me about that.
Yeah, so it's occasionally really, like, fun and useful when people are, like, having a side conversation about, like, political economy as a concept, or especially a lot of the focus of it was grassroots organizing, and to be able to just, like, drop some Gamsian organizing theory on the, like, politics of direct action. Right. But outside of a party trick, it's, like, rarely actually that useful.
I mean, I'm sure it's kind of shaped a little bit of your worldview, but yes, I don't think of political science when I think of virtual reality, funnily enough. But I think that that's really interesting, and I wanted to explore it because I think a lot of people in the VR space come into it from one very specific avenue, that being gaming. Are you a gamer?
I am not a gamer. This has been...
Yes!
So I have
Thank God I'm also not a gamer.
I've been told by professors.
Right.
I've been told by, like, one of my readers on my thesis that I, for academic reasons, need to be playing more video games. I've been told this especially about Half-Life Alyx and about the first Portal game. It is literally on my, like, research to-do list to play Half-Life Alyx, and I haven't done it.
Have you played Portal?
I've watched another person play Portal as a child, which right now I'm counting that. That's...
Fair enough. I mean, it's really funny that you say that because I've definitely had similar experiences. So as... since we last talked, I've actually become one of the presidents of MIT ARVR, which is very exciting. And one of the parts of that is that my co-presidents have been trying to give me required reading, which has included, because I was telling them, you know, I'm not a gamer, you guys are really hardcore gamers, I don't understand what you guys are talking about, what video game should I play? And so last summer, along with my internship, I would every day diligently play Clash Royale on my phone. Because they were like, this is what you should start with. And now they're trying to get me into some of these, like, VR YouTubers. And they were also like, you need to watch Sword Art Online. And I was like, okay, I guess.
Watching Sword Art Online is also on my to-do list and has been for a long time. I've been hearing about there is a really big community working on precisely creating Sword Art Online.
I can believe that.
And they're, like, doing really, like, advanced UI design. And as a VR, like, UX designer, I need to know about this now.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's really interesting because, well, okay, for a little bit of background on myself, I am also interested in VR and AR, specifically through the, like, I think more on the graphics side, but I've also been doing a lot of stuff with audio. And I, you know, also through high school, I was in speech and debate. I was in stagecraft. I was doing all these things around storytelling. I was really recreationally, like, I was a writer. So all of my teachers were like, you should be a lawyer. And I was like, no. And I knew I wanted to go into computer science because luckily I had done a lot of that and I liked coding, and I was also like, I do want to make money.
Yeah.
So I knew I wanted to come here for computer science. Luckily I got in. And then I just joined AR/VR Club, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. This is storytelling. This is immersive. It's cutting edge. It's awesome. But I was not a gamer. It's actually funny you mentioned Portal, by the way, because the college that the students went to that it was designed at, DigiPen, is in my area. I used to take camps there growing up. And the Portal cake, which is a very famous element of it, is from a bakery that I used to get my birthday cakes at as a kid.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
That's
it's like
amazing.
from our area. So I have a connection to Portal, even though I've never played it, because I'm not a gamer.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I will say, if you are interested in narrative and storytelling and set design and things that are, I can't get into a lot of video games that have me do a lot of first person shooter style, you're not solving a puzzle, you're trying to figure out where in this semi-open world you need to walk. I'm stuck. I've been playing Stray, and I'm stuck 4 hours into a gameplay of Stray because I can't figure out how to navigate the space. So if you are like me in this domain and you don't really like a lot of the video game parts of video games, but are into the storytelling, the interesting design choices, if you have not played Experienced, it's not really a game, Notes on Blindness, it's incredible. I think of it as the best VR piece just out there right now, and super hot. Has pretty solid narrative storytelling in a sort of vague and ominous fashion, and the best UX design just anywhere.
I will check this out, probably immediately after this episode.
Good.
But yeah, I think that one of the things that's very interesting is that because VR right now is mainly a gamer-dominated space.
Yeah.
It's interesting to come from a perspective that's not that, and then kind of be able to, I don't know, I feel like I have a very different perspective on a lot of things that I guess are more default in VR. The focus on video games and shooters and motion mechanics don't really interest me. I'm more interested in how can people other than video gamers use VR, and I've been trying to explore that more. So do you want to talk a little bit about your perspective on that?
Absolutely. This is something I'm actually pivoting into with my a lot of my PhD research. This is something that I've started to have a lot of ideas about. So I've spent some time focused on how people interact with data in VR, basic mechanics of grabbing stuff and moving around and carrying objects. But the thing that I've started to focus on much more right now is social presence and avatars. So how we represent ourselves in virtual spaces, how we represent other people, what data you need to collect off of a person's body to represent that body in virtual environments. And a lot of this is because some of the most successful VR games right now are not really game-like. They are just social spaces. They are just places to hang out that give you almost no structure or thing to do on top of that.
Yes.
VR chat being the biggest one of these, but there's lots of pseudo VR chat spaces. Yeah.
So avatars.
Avatars.
Are you a fan of the Mark Zuckerberg school of avatar building?
I think that a lot of my ideas about VR come directly from looking at things that Meta does and going, not that.
Go ahead.
So I think Horizon's avatars are terrible, but for a variety of reasons.
Okay.
Horizon's avatars they did really well on letting you have some amount of racial diversity, which most avatar creators up to this point in time have done a terrible job of.
Right. You
have 4 skin tones, and you have a lot of types of noses that look approximately like this nose, and then 2 noses that are not like that. They do a terrible job on representing faces in a racial diversity way. Horizon's knocked that out of the park. They did great, wonderfully on that. The thing that they did very poorly is that you can't make a Horizon's avatar who looks in any way unique or unattractive. Everyone has weirdly perfectly smooth skin. Everyone's face is precisely symmetrical. And because of that, it introduces this strange sort of ominous perfection about the whole space that's really interesting. Yeah. Right, they've figured out, this is septum piercings, for example, certain types of piercings, certain types of glasses. They figured out, this is a desirable trait that some people have actively gone out of their way to have. And so you can have those. But for things that I think are, important in how people actually look and think of themselves as looking, things like having acne, things like having a sort of weird mark on a specific part of your face, the fact that no one's face is symmetrical and the 2 halves look different, it can't represent any of that. And I think it's a really interesting set of things to have left out.
haven't, dove too deep into like looking into those, but from what I saw like on the internet, I was reminded of the like in like Wii or in Xbox, those little avatars where you can like pick the nose and like pick the eye color and whatever, but it's all on this little like balloon face. It kind of reminded me of that, and it's I mean, obviously, like back then, good for them. You can change your your eyes and whatever, but especially in VR where so much of it is about you being in the space, it's not just the space being around you, it's you being in the space. Yeah. So I think that that's definitely going to be very important going forward.
Yeah.
And that gets you into things like open source, which I know that you're very passionate about. A lot of us are very passionate about. How did you sort of get involved with the whole open sourcing community? Because that's its own beast of a community.
Absolutely. So I think of myself as still very a novice in the open source community. I have not done a lot of like successfully contributing to large-scale open source projects. I'd like to think that someday I will be doing something like managing a large-scale open source repository that other people are using, but like I understand that right now it is beyond my organizational capacity, and in particular just like Git skill level. It's beyond what I got in that domain. But I do care a lot about the ideology of it. And I care a lot about the idea that if you make something and you don't absolutely need, for some reason, to keep it closed, you should make it open. That's it.
Do you want to define that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So open source code is any code in which someone has written the thing and it is now publicly available for anyone to use, sometimes with no restrictions whatsoever, sometimes with some restrictions, such as like not for commercial use. And the most common of these restrictions is some open source code can only be used in other projects which are themselves open source, which has a sort of viral property. That one's very much on purpose. Some projects that are like this are these like massive repositories that are like maintained by many people, and they've got a wiki, and they're like well structured.
And a Discord server.
And a Discord server, if you are Lucas. And a lot of them are like someone has put their code online. Maybe it has some good documentation that says this could be useful to you. Here's how you use it. So very, very different scales of projects.
And it's always those small ones, though, that end up being like, it's some guy in Nebraska who's written like Ron's like magic number thing, and it just tells you, like, it tells the computer this is a number, and it holds up the entire internet. And if he takes one day off, like, that's it.
It's a very rickety thing. Yeah. I mean, I think this is more true for the internet as a space than VR as a space. Except for parts where the VR is built on top of the internet. I think some of this is because the internet is a bigger, more densely connected and older project. And so everything is built on top of everything else.
Well, like the whole like Y2K thing that happened.
Yeah. So on the topic of our man in Nebraska who holds up the entire internet, there is this like strange calcification process in which like new internet is built on top of old internet. And so we get these things where like if a piece of code fails, everything is built on top of that. I think so there are instances of this. Yeah, the most famous example of this being like Y2K. And we have one that is coming up that is like modern Y2K. This is the Epoch Apocalypse.
Oh gosh.
It is worth Googling the details on this because this is just sort of pulled from an email thread that I read a while back.
Okay, well first, so for our audience, what's
course.
Y2K?
So Y2K, in broader culture, is now I think seen as kind of like a joke and like, lol, that's an apocalypse that we thought would happen, but what
and
a
also
weird
now
thing
it's like
we
a fashion
freaked out
thing.
about. And now it's a fashion thing because that's the era as well. But Y2K was this concern that when the year switched over from 1999 to 2000, lots of computer systems had built such that they didn't have enough memory to store 4 full digits of a year, and so they would simply flip over to being 0. And there is this like broader narrative and myth now that like that was a weird thing to be worried about because nothing happened. But the reason why nothing happened is that in the years leading up to Y2K, a bunch of computer scientists and database managers and sysadmins put in a huge amount of work to prevent issues. And like some things still did go wrong, but like for the most part, things did not go wrong because people did a ton of work. Anywho, we have a similar one that is coming up relatively soon, which is the Epoch Apocalypse. The epoch is a term in like system date time, which is the number of some unit of time. It might be seconds, it might be milliseconds, something like that, since the beginning of time.
Oh, of course.
Which is, of course, defined as sometime in 1970.
Of course.
Anywho, the number of this unit of time since the beginning of time in 1970 right now can be represented by either 64 or 32-bit systems. But that number is growing continuously every time, every time a second passes, the number goes up a little bit. And we are approaching the point in time at which it can no longer be represented by 32-bit systems, which will break a lot of older things. Basically, every random guy in Nebraska who wrote a piece of code before 2005, that piece of code will fail.
Oh God.
And so right now we are in the space that is like 1998, where you're like, oh man, it's coming, where people are doing these big system revisions, and that huge amount of work is happening again.
And I think part of why it's so hard to do this with the internet is the internet is not a solid layer built on a solid layer. It's not like Legos. It's like a spider web, and you don't know your Google query how many random guy from Nebraska pieces of code that no company is responsible for. So nobody is responsible for updating that. And maybe the random guy from Nebraska decided to not do that anymore.
Because notably, the random guy from Nebraska is generally not paid. He does this for free for most instances of random guy from Nebraska, which in some ways is really beautiful and generous, and in some ways is does lead us into a lot of issues of access in the open source community and equity and whatever.
Yeah, I had... There's this funny joke that I had seen online, which was the entire internet is held up by 20 people who are probably all at a gaming or a furry convention, and if they all die, then the internet goes with them. This
is actually a conversation that I've been thinking about relatively recently, is there, especially for big pieces of cybersecurity critical things, a vast quantity of those are maintained by specifically furries who tend to all be busy at the same point in time because a major hub of the community is conventions. And I do think that some of the biggest furry conventions should be treated as a national cybersecurity risk.
If something happens, then that's it.
Absolutely.
Everyone's there.
I'm fairly certain, I'm pretty confident that the weekend out of the entire year where the U.S. is most at risk for a cybersecurity attack is the weekend of Anthrocon.
The thing is, you're right. You're right.
But this raises the more important question of are foreign governments who are thinking about cybersecurity risk and thinking about doing cybersecurity spookiness actively having conversations about furries. This is what I need to know.
Oh God, we can't give them the idea. We can't let them know.
Oh, it's a good thing we're not saying this on a podcast.
Oh, absolutely not. Delete that footage. No, but yeah, it's definitely true. And I think that, especially for VR, it's a similar thing where most of the people, running these open source communities are gamers. And most of VR development, I feel is being driven by gamers. Actually, one of the things that I've definitely been discussing a lot with, the whole underdog industry thing of I think VR has the potential to, it's run by gamers. It's this new piece of technology. And with that, it has the potential to bring in people from the fringes. With every new piece of technology that increases access, increases capabilities, it can also increase access and bring up people. But if we want it to do that, we have to be actively designing it to do that. And so a lot of people right now who are, leading VR development, realistically, are white or Asian, male, straight gamers, which, good for them. Thank you for your service. But also, there's not every perspective. And so I think that one of the really promising things with the open source community is you have a lot of this energy from mostly gamers being mobilized to create amazing stuff that's then open source. And with that whole thing of open source kind of being viral, it's making a large portion of all this work and development very accessible for people to change. And I'm sure that there's probably instances of that being used for accessibility or for increasing access to different marginalized groups.
There is a sort of like, so especially in terms of like this idea of like the open source community and a lot of the open source community that is doing work on VR right now being primarily men who play a lot of video games and are mostly white and sometimes Asian. It does really get us into this, like, the politics of open source as a community. And there is this, like, while simultaneously open source is, like, by definition broadly accessible in some ways, it is literally code that has been posted for free that you can use as any person. It does have, like, interesting structural barriers. So, like, there is, I don't know, a lot of theory out there that a lot of the reason why open source communities are so aggressively white and, like, so aggressively male and, like, so aggressively, like, people who have a lot of wealth, etc., is because in order to be able to do labor that you're not compensated for, you like have to have the sort of like financial stability to do that. Yeah,
definitely. And I think it's definitely true. And then hopefully we can recognize that that's true and then connect those people with people who, you know, maybe have different, like I think you were telling me earlier about the whole movement with open source, like VR chat versus Horizon Worlds.
Yeah.
With the stuff about making the
so there's the sort of like there's the like the two sides of this where like in some ways the open source community can be like sort of inaccessible to be part of because it means doing labor for free, but like beyond that open source projects are so much more malleable, and because of that marginalized groups are really able to use them in their own way much more. And so I think that like the primary example that I have of this in social VR settings is this like dichotomy between the way that Meta has set up Horizon Worlds and the way in which people are using VR chat. Horizon Worlds is a really closed ecosystem. Your avatars have a very limited constraints on the way they can look. Your avatar, last I checked, can't have acne. No one in Horizon Worlds has acne.
This is every high schooler's dream.
I mean, yes, but also, like, everyone's face is very symmetrical. There's a really tight limit on what you can look like and how you can interact with the world. And VR chat has just no limits on anything ever, as far as I can tell. And this difference does have some benefits to Horizon Worlds, to be clear. Like, there is a lot of harassment on VR chat. If you are just in a public space, you will be harassed, and it's going to take less than 5 minutes. It's going to happen.
Right.
And that's much less true of Horizon Worlds. By being more constrained, it is easier to moderate. People do not have the option in such a closed environment to make your life particularly bad.
Right.
But at the same time, it isn't wildly useful for a lot of marginalized groups. VR chat is being used right now by a lot of really marginalized communities in really interesting and novel ways. So, like, I think the most interesting of these, first, one of them, it's furries. But the deaf community in VR chat right now is doing really, really fascinating stuff that I think could be a bigger source of study for, like, linguists, and especially linguists who think about signed language. So a lot of VR chat users who are deaf, they're using index controllers, because index controllers can pick up the position of your hands and they can pick up some level of hand tracking.
Right.
But they can't do everything. And so in finger spelling, there's like a couple of letters that you cannot indicate with an index controller. M is the notable example, which I think is, it's
I might be doing it backwards, but
it's got a bit where the thumb crosses underneath the fingers. And that the index controllers can't pick it up because they're capacitive. And so people in VR chat's deaf community have been figuring out alternate ways of modifying their language to be able to communicate. And so, like, M in the deaf communities in VR chat is like you use both hands. And
because, like, otherwise the controller can't pick up, it'll just pick it up like that.
Exactly.
And then, you know, that would be the same for N versus M.
Exactly.
I know a little finger spelling.
Good. That's fantastic. I think I have, like, 1 or 2 letters. At some point I knew how to do this.
Yeah.
It's an important skill.
Definitely, no. I think definitely ASL X language on my list.
Good. Good.
At least finger spelling.
It is the only one that you may suddenly find there are many languages that you could suddenly find yourself needing to know, but it's one of the more important ones where if you find yourself really, really needing to know it, that is your first and only language now.
Yeah. But no, definitely. And I actually did a lot of accessibility work in high school. I got sort of into the whole, like, accessible design, especially for education, specifically for me, music education. And one of the things I love about VR is, like, you're adding a whole new dimension, right? And a whole new level of immersion. And so, especially for people with sensory disabilities that could have the, you know, like, a whole lot of potential, it also could based on how we design things, be really, really limiting. You know, if we, you know, design things to be, for example, like purely visual, then, well, that's it for, like, for example, for people with low vision or blind people. If we design things to really rely on audio, you know, that's just going to but the other thing is, since we have this like multi-dimensional space, we theoretically have more potential to design things to be more accessible, but we just need to do it.
Exactly.
And I think it's definitely about, like, you know, who's in the room. You know, I always say, like, being in VR club right now is like being in computer science club in the 80s. And it's just true. It's like, we're right on the frontier of things, right?
Absolutely. Like, it is like every single person working in VR right now. Not everyone. There are now, like, people who are working for companies, etc. But the vast majority of people working in VR right now are the guy in Nebraska.
We are that guy.
We are that guy. And it does, in some ways, it's like this really, like, fun, exciting Wild West. And in some ways, like, the choices that we're making are going to be the thing that creates VR's Y2K, which will be either our problem to solve or someone else's problem to solve as this, like, grows and we build layers on top of it. I don't know where I was going with that sentence when I started it.
Well, the other thing is that, realistically, we wouldn't have been in computer science club in the 80s.
That's fair.
So it's cool but we get to be here now, you know? And I think that, for me, especially as someone who is not a gamer, someone who is coming at this from much more of a social justice, storytelling, you know, user experience, sort of immersive point of view, it's cool to be able to, like, be in these conversations and be like, I have a piece of information that I'm pretty sure you would not have known. Like, for example, last year we were working on this live captioning model for an AR headset. So I could be talking to you, I would have captions of what you were saying. Great, wonderful. And all the technology pretty much exists for that, so we were just trying to put it together, and we were like, oh, well, where should we put the captions? We can use face tracking to put it near the face, where should we put it? And the people I was working with were like, oh, let's put it on people's chests. And I was like, that's interesting. That's a really interesting choice. I have one, but what if you're talking to a girl, though? And they were like, oh, interesting. And it's like, there's no blame or anything here. Like, there's plenty of stuff that I wouldn't have thought about, but luckily, I was in that room to be the person who thought about that, you know?
Absolutely. And I think that, like, especially in hardware more than anywhere else, in VR, there are so many choices where someone made a decision, and lots of people must have reviewed it, and then someone committed enough money to build millions of copies of expensive hardware, probably not millions, hundreds of thousands, a lot of copies of expensive hardware, and at no point anywhere in that pipeline was there any woman
in any of those rooms.
There's, like, a ton of decisions that are like this. So I think my favorite example that is the most, like, egregious is with the Magic Leap. The Magic Leap did understand that wearing a heavy battery and a lot of compute power on your head anywhere is an uncomfortable location. Right. Does not feel good. And their solution to this was the, like, little hockey puck magic pack or whatever they call it. It's, like, hand-sized, and it's, like, 2 inches thick, and it's kind of heavy, and it's got a big clip on it. Right. And the idea is that you clip it onto your body. And if you were dressed like me in the standard male engineer uniform of, like, a relatively rugged pair of jeans with a belt, it clips onto the belt, and it's fine. It works. The cable is the right length. It's very, very comfortable. And if you are anyone who is not wearing the standard engineer outfit, man edition, there's nowhere to put this object. It's heavy, and the way that the clip is designed, if you don't have pockets because you are wearing literally any item of women's clothing, it doesn't work. And if you do have pockets because you have something like a dress with pockets or women's jeans with, like, the edge that you could clip it to, the materials that are used are different.
Right.
So I was working at Wellesley, and I got to interact with one of these before I transitioned, and it was hysterical to watch every single person try on this device and have it not fit their clothes in different ways. So, like, I clipped it onto my pants, and at this point in time, I'm still wearing women's jeans, and they're stretchier. Right. And so you clip the power pack thing onto the pants, and it simply turns, like, it bends the fabric out and then falls off.
I can imagine what you're saying, right. And then, obviously, dresses, skirts, leggings, not happening.
Exactly. VR is fundamentally, it is a wearable space. You are making things that go on people.
Right. And you know what's so interesting is that, like, wearables are traditionally dominated by, like, being marketed to females and to women. Like, and it's so fascinating to me to, like, first of all, did they bring in no actual wearable designers? Is it gamers making wearables? Is that it? Because, like, and then the other thing is, like, it's so fascinating to see these wearables that are so not marketed towards females in such a, like, funny, comical way.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the idea of, like, a VR headset as a computer that you wear on your face is a wearable technology is, like, not really a way that I hear it discussed that often.
I know. And I mean, I imagine, so you went to Wellesley, did you ever have any experiences where, like, you, like, other, you know, people were trying the headsets on and had problems?
Absolutely. So I had the great joy of, I was the first TA for Wellesley's first VR class. It was CS 321, Virtual and Augmented Realities. Very proud of it. But it meant that I had the great joy of TAing a VR class at a women's college, and I got to see the whole diversity of ways in which VR headsets are not designed for women.
Right.
A lot of them involve Velcro in their straps, and in particular, long, straight hair and Velcro is, like, the worst combination because the hair goes through the Velcro and then it's not good.
Yeah.
You've experienced this. Curly hair does not fit under a lot of headset designs, and in particular, long curly hair, especially because you frequently, like, have to tie it up, does not fit under a headset. It just...
Or, like, natural hairstyles for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I've also been told by folk with natural hairstyles, like, especially folk who, like, are black and have, like, relatively, like, shaped, like, kinkier hair, that even if you can get the headset on, it dents your hair.
Oh, God.
And you have to, like, reshape your hair after wearing it, which seems terrible.
That's awful. Oh, my... Yeah, but, like, again, this is all towards the point of, you know, VR has, I think, a lot of potential for these, you know, for a ton of marginalized, especially even queer communities. I know that you were talking about earlier, like, identity and being able to represent it yourself in VR spaces.
Absolutely. So this is one of the many ways in which VR chat, by being a lawless, like, open, you know, modern version of, like, a 1990s dinosaur chat room, has allowed a lot of people to explore gender in particular, and has, like, opened a real space for, like, people who are questioning the gender situation and or trans. Especially folk who know that they are trans, but they're, like, not out in their public life yet and are figuring out how to do that. Because it's hard. It's a big commitment. It's really hard to go back on. It can have very serious social consequences. And so a lot of folk, because you can bring your physical body into VR chat in the sense that you are embodied within the space, but you don't bring your physical body in the sense that your body looks like you, will use VR chat as a place to test out different gender expressions.
And also be perceived as different gender expressions.
And see how other people treat them, and if that feels right. Yeah.
Definitely. It's like, there's so much potential there. Even, like we talked about earlier with access, for example, for people with disabilities. I think also it has a lot of potential, even just in general, to broaden, like, again, with every technology that gets broader, hopefully it brings in a broader amount of people. But the thing is, we got to design it to do that. And, you know, we said earlier that, you know, we wouldn't have been in Computer Science Club in the 80s. But we're here now. And the other thing is we get to open the doors for people, hopefully, who, like, you know, because a lot of problems we wouldn't even know about. And so it's very exciting. It is the Wild West, but hopefully, you know, there's a greater variety of cowboys.
That was good. That was good.
I love trying to come up with good segues, but do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah. So I think my one, for any VR developers at home who happen to be watching this, my one big takeaway from the whole conversation is if you make any form of hardware anything, but hardware in particular, you need to have someone who is not you try it on, and not just, like, not you in the sense that they are a different person than you, but not you in the sense that they are a different gender, they are a different height. The first wearable project that I ever made was a glove, and my hands are kind of small, and then I took it to a member week, and I had a, like, 50-year-old banker man try to put it on, and he couldn't. So people whose bodies are different sizes and different shapes and whose experience of the world is different than you, have them try on your stuff.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's not going to fit them.
We gotta bring everyone in. But yeah, I don't think I can top the Wild West thing, so I'm just gonna give up on the segues.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
And thank you so much for listening. And this has been On the Dome. Okay. What do you think are the odds?
That's fingers crossed. We've gotten more in it every time.